From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Today we are swept away by our joy at the fact that Julian will shortly be with us.
In a stunning decision, a British judge has blocked the extradition of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to the United States, saying he would not be safe in a U.S. prison due to his deteriorated mental state. Could Julian Assange soon be a free man for the first time in nearly a decade? Then, as Georgia prepares for two Senate runoff elections and Tuesday, President Trump's been recorded on tape threatening Georgia's Republican Secretary of State to overturn Joe Biden's victory in the state.
So, look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state.
We'll go to Georgia for the latest. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A British judge has blocked the extradition of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to the United States, where he could have faced up to 175 years in prison. In an extraordinary decision, Judge Vanessa Baraitser said Assange would not be safe in U.S. prisons due to the state of his mental health and the increased risk of suicide. Judge Baraitser said, quote, "I find the mental condition of Mr. Assange is such that it would be oppressive to extradite him to the United States of America." Supporters of Assange celebrated outside the London courthouse.
Do celebrate that the American prison system is so bad that even this judge wouldn't send Julian Assange into it.
In 2019, Julian Assange was indicted in the United States on 17 counts of violating the Espionage Act related to the publication of classified documents exposing U.S. war crimes in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. We'll have more on the story after headlines. President Trump repeatedly pressured Georgia's Republican Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to change the results of the presidential election in Georgia during an hour-long phone call Saturday. And the Washington Post published audio of the stunning conversation in which Trump suggested Raffensperger announce officials recalculated votes. Raffensperger responded to Trump, quote, "The data you have is wrong." This is an excerpt of that phone call.
I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state. This is a faulty election result. And honestly, this should go very fast. You should meet tomorrow, because you have a big election coming up, and because of what you've done to the president, you know, the people of Georgia know that this was a scam. And because of what you've done to the president, a lot of people aren't going out to vote.
President Trump tried to get Raffensperger to agree that thousands of ballots had been destroyed, threatening consequences if he did not support the baseless claim, a possible attempt at extortion. The audio was released just 2 days before the two Georgia runoff races Tuesday, which will determine control of the U.S. Senate. Over 3 million Georgia residents have already cast their ballots in a record turnout for runoff elections. On Thursday, incumbent Republican Senator David Perdue said he was quarantining after possible exposure to the coronavirus. He's facing off against Democrat Jon Ossoff. Incumbent Republican Senator Kelly Loeffler is running against Reverend Raphael Warnock. Trump is campaigning in the conservative stronghold of Dalton, Georgia today, while President-elect Joe Biden will be in Atlanta. Vice President-elect Kamala Harris campaigned in Savannah on Sunday. In more election news, as many as 140 Republican Congress members and at least 12 senators plan to contest the official counting of the Electoral College vote on Wednesday. Senator Ted Cruz is spearheading the effort among senators in the latest desperate attempt to overturn Joe Biden's victory and buoy Trump's baseless claims of widespread voter fraud. Congress will still have a majority of lawmakers to certify Joe Biden's win. On Sunday, the 117th Congress was sworn in amidst the worsening coronavirus pandemic and Trump's attempts to overturn the election. Cori Bush, a Black Lives Matter activist, formerly unhoused single mother, was sworn in to represent Missouri's 1st congressional district. She tweeted, "I've survived sexual assault, police abuse, domestic violence, and being unhoused and uninsured. That's not a unique pain I carry. It's one that so many of us live with each day. Today, I take my seat in Congress to fight for a world where nobody has to endure that pain," she said. Nancy Pelosi was reelected as House Speaker by a narrow margin, with Democrats holding the slimmest majority in 20 years with 222 seats to Republicans 211, with 2 seats undecided. In its last major act, the 116th Congress voted on New Year's Day to override President Trump's veto of the $740 billion military budget bill. Senate Republican leaders did not allow an up or down vote on a House bill to increase coronavirus stimulus checks to $2,000 per person. This all comes as the U.S. has topped 351,000 COVID-19 deaths and 20.6 million confirmed cases as hospitals brace themselves for an even greater surge due to holiday travel and social gatherings. California remains an epicenter in the United States with over 45,000 new cases reported Sunday. Ambulances are reporting wait times of up to 8 hours to transfer patients to hospitals, which are already near their breaking point, in turn leading to a shortage of paramedics and longer 911 response times. Los Angeles morgues say they cannot keep up with the mounting daily death toll, which has averaged 178 over the past week, or 1 death every 8 minutes. Funeral homes have had to turn away grieving families. Shelters and services for unhoused people in L.A. are reporting being overwhelmed by new spikes in cases. In Tacoma, Washington, police evicted housing activists who'd occupied a Travelodge motel since Christmas to shelter over 40 unhoused people. The group Tacoma Housing Now has been requesting city officials take advantage of a federal funding program to cover the costs of housing people in unused hotel rooms during the pandemic. Baltimore recently announced it's extending contracts with hotels to accommodate unhoused people using FEMA funds through March. Meanwhile, the coronavirus variant, first identified in Britain, which is believed to be significantly more contagious but not more deadly, has now been reported in over 30 countries and 3 U.S. states: Colorado, California, and Florida. As frustrations mount over the slow rollout of vaccines, the U.S. will consider cutting Moderna doses in half for adults up to the age of 55. The U.S. has vaccinated just over 4.2 million people, falling far short of its original goal of vaccinating 20 million people by the end of 2020. In international news, India has approved 2 vaccines against COVID-19, the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine and Bharat Biotech's domestically developed Covaxin. Indian health experts and politicians expressed alarm that Covaxin was approved without any published data on its efficacy. India aims to inoculate 300 million frontline workers, elderly and vulnerable people out of its 1.35 billion population by August. Britain became the first country today to start administering doses of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. In related news, the World Health Organization listed Pfizer-BioNTech's COVID-19 vaccine for emergency use Thursday, which should allow less wealthy countries to expedite their own regulatory approval process for the vaccine. In the Middle East, over 1 million Israelis, or over 1/10 of the population, has already received their first dose of the Pfizer-BioNTech shot, the highest rate of vaccination against the coronavirus in the world. But human rights groups say Israeli authorities are excluding Palestinians in the occupied territories from the vaccine rollout, even as settlers in those regions receive the shots. Palestinian authorities say they plan to use COVAX, the UN's mechanism to ensure fair distribution of vaccines, to vaccinate some of its population. A deadly blast at the Aden airport in Yemen Wednesday killed at least 26 people and injured dozens. The attack came as a plane carrying members of a newly formed Saudi-backed cabinet was landing at the airport. 3 International Red Cross workers, at least 1 journalist, were killed. Yemeni officials blame Houthi rebels who denied they were responsible. Saudi air raids were launched in Houthi-controlled Sana'a following the blast. On Friday, an explosion in the port city of Hodeidah killed 5 women at a wedding hall. Government and Houthi forces both blame the other side for the attack. In Afghanistan, Bismillah Adel Amak, a 28-year-old radio journalist from Ghor province, was shot dead in a car ambush on Friday. He's at least the 5th media professional to be killed in Afghanistan in under 2 months. No group has claimed responsibility for the killing. In a separate attack, civil society activist Abdi Jahid was also reported killed. Intra-Afghan peace talks are set to resume this week in Doha amidst an ongoing surge in violence. In Pakistan, the Islamic State has claimed responsibility for Saturday's attack on a coal mine in the western province of Balochistan, which left 11 miners dead. The killings sparked protests among members of Pakistan's Hazara Shia Muslim minority. This is Hazara lawyer Mohammad Raza.
The government has failed to control these terrorists. The Hazara community reserves the right to protest this, and federal and provincial governments both are responsible for this.
In Iraq, thousands of protesters flooded Baghdad's Tahrir Square on Monday to mark the first anniversary of President Trump's assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general killed in a U.S. drone strike near Baghdad International Airport. The protests came as Iranian leaders warned the Trump administration may be planning an attack before Joe Biden is sworn in on January 20th. The U.S. has flown B-52 bombers over the Persian Gulf at least 3 times over the past month, and over the weekend, the Pentagon reversed plans to withdraw the USS Nimitz aircraft carrier from the region. In Nigeria, the prominent journalist and activist Omoyele Sowore was beaten and arrested with other protesters at a peaceful New Year's Eve gathering in the capital, Abuja. The protesters were airing grievances against the Nigerian president, Muhammadu Buhari, when members of a police unit known as the Rapid Response Squad descended on their candlelight procession. Sowore reported he suffered a broken nose and was denied bail for allegedly violating COVID-19 protocols. Sowore Omoyele is a former presidential candidate in Nigeria and the founder of the New York-based news outlet Sahara Reporters. He was arrested in 2019 on charges including treason after he organized peaceful nationwide protests against Nigeria's government. To see our last interview with Sowore, go to DemocracyNow.org. A warning to our audience. This story contains disturbing footage of a police raid. Police in Minneapolis have released body camera footage of the killing of Dalal Eid, a 23-year-old Somali American who was shot to death by police officers in a gas station parking lot last Wednesday. It was the first killing by Minneapolis police since the death of George Floyd, May 25th. The Minneapolis Police Department says the video shows Eid fired at the officers first, but the footage is inconclusive and family members dispute the claim. About 8 hours hours after the shooting, just past 2 a.m. on New Year's Eve, Hennepin County Sheriff's deputies raided the home of Ead's family, where they zip-tied the hands of the adults as terrified children looked on. Video of the raid shows officers did not explain the reason for their search warrant and only told the family Dalal Ead had been killed as they were making their exit. The killing has sparked new protests in support of Black lives in Minneapolis. A panel of federal judges has reinstated the execution of Lisa Montgomery, the only woman on federal death row, for January 12th. The decision reversed a ruling 1 week earlier allowing for the postponement of Montgomery's execution because her lawyers contracted COVID-19. Montgomery's attorney is asking the court to reconsider the ruling. She was convicted for the gruesome 2004 murder of a pregnant woman, but advocates have been asking for clemency and say Montgomery suffers from mental illness caused by a life of abuse. If the execution goes ahead, Lisa Montgomery will be the first woman to be executed by the federal government in nearly 70 years. Samuel Little, a serial killer who confessed to committing 93 murders between 1970 and 2005, died last week at the age of 80. Little's victims included mostly young Black women who were estranged from their families or struggling with poverty or other issues, and their deaths did not receive widespread attention. Many of the murders were attributed to overdoses or accidental or undetermined causes. The FBI described Little as the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. In Texas, authorities are investigating the death of Drill Sergeant Jessica Mitchell, whose body was found in a bullet-riddled car in San Antonio on New Year's Day. Authorities are also investigating the death of soldier Asia Graham in Texas, who was discovered dead in her military barracks on New Year's Eve. And the Census Bureau missed its December 31st deadline to produce its final counts for 2020. Those numbers will determine representation in Congress and the number of electoral votes in each state. If the results are not ready before Trump leaves office, his attempt to exclude undocumented people from the final count is expected to fail. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. When we come back, a stunning decision by a British judge. WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange will not be extradited to the United States. Stay with us.
To my metal face bros with stomachs of cast iron, who've been into wind and blast to the last siren. On the slow mode, the con artist with the so-so chick checks them out like Heidi did the slow down Milosevic. Anywho, how about the Yankees? Once I leave off stage, the party people thanks me. If I may speak freely, nasty like the freaky deaky at your local sleazy speakeasy. For any fan of the limelight, in the mic stand was left a lit stick of dynamite. It's risky business like hand-to-hand crack sale of rappers who's better off on the cover of Black Tail. Jump at you, who's a fat, who's that, who cats, who do match, be like, tell me how you do's that, heck no. Especially those who cop please like Gecko. Let go to Mike, do techno. Ha-ha, the bets are bust out laughing at the bet. For no reason you get cussed out like Tourette. Yet tight flow to make her bad ass stutter, or even crack a smile from a mad fast cutter. But wordplay since third grade age. Back when we used to play bang, open birdcage. Hip hop, Benny Hill, sip Henny straight, get every penny weight, then he chill. At any rate, my metal face with tongue, all these eye ring. Do yourself, I will continue to do my thing like kung fu fighting. Everybody was biting, and the super villain strike again like lightning at the same spot. Now what's the chance of that? And a name drop like pick a name out the hat. That's a no jobber from the lava canava who folk player out the rap game like survival while I drop degrees like a nerd cat. With intense speech from way back and spin on your back and then freeze while I play high ball, low ball to zero. So-called rhymers, go call clear while
I Hear Voices by MF Doom. On New Year's Eve, it was announced the seminal rapper had passed away in October at the age of 49. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A British judge has blocked the extradition of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to the United States, where he would have faced up to 175 years in prison. In a stunning decision, Judge Vanessa Baraitser said Assange would not be safe in U.S. prisons due to the state of his mental health. Judge Baraitser said, quote, I am satisfied that in these harsh conditions, Mr. Assange's mental health would deteriorate, causing him to commit suicide. I find that the mental condition of Mr. Assange is such that it would be oppressive to extradite him to the United States of America, she said. The United States said it would appeal the ruling. Supporters of Assange, including former British Ambassador Craig Murray, celebrated outside the London courthouse this morning.
Today we are swept away by our joy at the fact that Julian will shortly be with us. We have a judgment which I think makes an excuse to deliver justice, an excuse based on the appalling conditions in American prisons, an excuse based on the effect that would have on American mental health, and perhaps a sign that the authorities are not prepared to follow through the persecution and destruction of a man for political reasons.
Julian Assange's partner, Stella Morris, also spoke shortly after the judge's ruling.
I had hoped that today would be the day that Julian would come home. Today is not that day, but that day will come soon. Yeah. As long as Julian has to endure suffering in isolation as an unconvicted prisoner in Belmarsh prison, and as long as our children continue to be bereft of their father's love and affection, we cannot celebrate. We will celebrate the day he comes home. Today is a victory for Julian. Yes. Today's victory is the first step towards justice in this case. We are pleased that the court has recognized the seriousness and inhumanity of what he has endured and what he faces. But let's not forget, the indictment in the U.S. has not been dropped. We are extremely concerned that the U.S. government has decided to appeal this decision. It continues to want to punish Julian and make him disappear into the deepest, darkest hole of the U.S. prison system for the rest of his life. That can never happen. We will never accept that journalism is a crime in this country or any other.
Stella Morris, Julian Assange's partner, is the mother of 2 of his children. In 2019, Julian Assange was indicted in the United States on 17 counts of violating the Espionage Act related to the publication of classified documents exposing U.S. war crimes in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. Press freedom advocates campaigned against his prosecution, saying it would set a dangerous precedent for prosecuting journalists. Assange has been locked up at Belmarsh, one of Britain's most high-security prisons, since his arrest in April of 2019. He'd spent the previous 7 years inside the Ecuadorian embassy, where he'd been granted political asylum. In a statement, Amnesty International said, quote, "We welcome the fact that Julian Assange will not be sent to the USA, but this does not absolve the UK from having engaged in this politically motivated process at the behest of the USA and putting media freedom and freedom of expression on trial," they said. We're joined by 2 guests. Joining us from Sydney, Australia, is Jennifer Robinson, human rights attorney who's been advising Julian Assange and WikiLeaks since 2010. And here in New York, Jamil Jaffer is with us, founding director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. Last year, he submitted expert testimony to Judge Baraitser in the Assange extradition proceeding. Jennifer, let's go to you first. In Australia, you're usually inside the courtroom. Can you respond to this stunning decision of the judge?
Well, I attended remotely from Sydney, and it is a welcome decision in the sense that the judge recognised in her judgment that Julian should not be extradited to the United States, but on the narrow grounds that his extradition is oppressive, not for press freedom concerns, but because of the specific medical condition and his declining mental health and the specific prison conditions that he would face once returned to the United States, those being special administrative measures, which is effectively solitary confinement. This is still very concerning, and free speech groups should still be concerned. We will be looking more closely at the judgment in the coming days. But she agreed with the US prosecution in all other matters, including in respect of the free speech arguments that we had raised about the application of the First Amendment, the unprecedented nature of this case, and the fact that Julian wouldn't get a fair trial once returned to the United States. So while we are obviously pleased with the outcome, I'm delighted for his partner, and this has been a very long 10-year battle for us. The fact that she's now decided not to extradite him is a positive one. But I think for free speech groups, for journalists everywhere, this is not the end of the road. And it shows that this is still a terrible precedent.
And the U.S. says they will appeal this. What does this mean? I mean, on the one hand, you have the possibility of him being freed this week, but could that appeal mean he remains in jail?
We will be making a bail application on Wednesday morning. That was decided this morning. But of course, the US has 2 weeks to appeal. They've already indicated that they will appeal and have indicated that they will likely oppose any bail application. So the right and correct position is that now that we have won this first battle, that he ought to be released on remand pending any appeal outcome. If the US is granted permission to appeal, because they must apply for permission, this could be pushed off for several months, perhaps later in the year. And he's already spent, as I said, almost over a decade under some form of confinement, almost 2 years in a high-security prison because of this US extradition request. And it's really time that the United States puts an end to this. This is an extraordinary prosecution. It never should have been started in the first place. The Obama administration chose not to indict. This case needs to be put to a close, and Julian should be allowed to get on with his life.
And for those who aren't familiar with what it is he released, can you explain this case and why he was inside in political exile inside the Ecuadorian embassy for so many years, and then taken by police and put into this supermax Belmarsh prison?
The indictment and the prosecution from the United States and this extradition case relates solely to publications back in 2010 and 2011. This included the publication of the Afghan war logs, the Iraq war logs, of course, the famous collateral murder video showing the murder of journalists in Iraq by US soldiers, and the US diplomatic cables. What we saw were evidence of war crimes, human rights abuse. And what was really important about the extradition proceedings is that we had evidence from human rights lawyers from around the world about the importance of WikiLeaks disclosures in human rights accountability efforts, whether we talk about Guantanamo Bay, the Iraq War, and so on. So this is what he was facing prosecution for, 175 years in prison for these important disclosures. And what's troubling about today's decision is that the judge has found that he could have been extradited had it not been for his medical condition. And that's a terrifying precedent for journalists.
Jamil Jaffer, if you could respond, you filed expert testimony in his case to this, again, stunning decision that was made by the judge in Britain this morning.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the decision is important and surprising, a very significant victory for Julian Assange. I think the press freedom implications are more complicated. The judge, while ultimately holding that Assange can't be extradited to the United States on the basis of his mental health and the conditions under which he would be held if he were extradited here, the judge largely endorses the U.S. prosecution theory. And that theory is based on an indictment that sweeps very, very broadly. That basically the indictment is an effort to hold Assange criminally responsible for acts that journalists engage in all the time. And it doesn't matter whether Assange himself is properly characterized as a journalist. That may be an important debate, but legally it's completely irrelevant. The important fact is that Assange has been indicted on the grounds that he engaged in activities like cultivating confidential sources, maintaining their confidentiality or maintaining the confidentiality of their identities, and publishing classified secrets. And of course, those things, all of those things are integral to national security journalism. And the press freedom fear here is that the prosecution of Assange and even the indictment itself will deter journalism that is important and necessary and that should be regarded as protected by the First Amendment. And I think that this ruling is, again, a victory for Assange, but insofar as it's an endorsement of the U.S.'s prosecution theory and of the underlying indictment, I think that indictment is going to continue to cast a kind of shadow over investigative journalism.
In 2014, I interviewed Julian Assange inside the Ecuadorian embassy. He talked about the challenges whistleblowers face in U.S. courts.
It is not possible for a national security whistleblower now in the United States to have a fair trial. It's not possible to have a fair trial because all the trials are held in Alexandria, Virginia, where the jury pool is comprised of the highest density of military and government employees in all of the United States. It's not possible to have a fair trial because the US government has a precedent of applying state secret privilege to prevent the defense from using material that is classified in their favor. It's not possible to have a fair trial because as a defendant in a national security case, you are held under special administrative measures, which makes it very hard to look at any of the material in your case, to meet with your lawyers, to speak to people, etc. So it's just simply not a fair system.
So that's Julian Assange inside the Ecuadorian embassy, where he had a political asylum in 2014. We may have among the most extensive global TV, radio broadcast interviews with Assange a number of times inside the embassy, also before that when he was under house arrest. And you can go to democracynow.org for that. But Jamil, last week you tweeted, "It is crucial to understand that the case isn't just incidentally about press freedom. The whole point of the case is to criminalize national security journalism." So let's talk about that. In fact, if you were listening to the judge today before the end, and I want to ask Jen Robinson about this, when she talked about his mental condition and what this could mean in U.S. prisons, a real indictment of U.S. prisons, it did sound like she was going in another direction on the issue of press freedom.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you have to understand here is that the Trump administration or the Department of Justice could have indicted Assange on much narrower grounds, and they did initially indict him on a violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And that prosecution would have raised some press freedom concerns too, but the press freedom concerns would have been much less significant than the ones that are raised by this Espionage Act indictment. So there was a decision made at some point to indict Assange on these broader grounds, even though narrower grounds might have been available. And the decision was made even though the Obama administration decided that there was no meaningful way to distinguish Assange's activities from the activities of journalists and mainstream media organizations in the United States. So there was a very deliberate decision to go after Assange with these very broad claims, even though these very broad charges, even though the Justice Department itself had concluded under President Obama that distinguishing Assange from journalists and mainstream news organizations was legally difficult, if not impossible. And I think that the only way to explain that decision is to understand that the whole point of the prosecution, the whole point of the indictment, is to cast a shadow over investigative journalism and national security journalism in particular. The point of this prosecution is not so much to go after Assange, because they could have done that on narrower grounds. The point of the prosecution is to criminalize national security journalism. I understand that that sounds extreme, but I really don't think that there's any other possible explanation for the decision to go after Assange in this particular way. The point is to get at the activities that journalists are engaged in all the time. Again, protecting confidential sources, communicating with them confidentially, cultivating sources, publishing classified secrets. These are the pillars of investigative journalism, of national security journalism in particular. And those things are the target of the indictment.
Jen Robinson, were you able to see him at Belmarsh?
We haven't been able to see Julian out at Belmarsh since the beginning of the year, since the COVID restrictions were implemented. I think it's really important to talk about the prison conditions he's faced in the United Kingdom so far because of this US extradition request. So we were not able to visit him in person since March, since the outbreak of COVID. He hasn't had social visits. It's made our ability to prepare for this case incredibly difficult. But the isolation that he has suffered already because of the prison conditions in the UK and because of the COVID pandemic, there's been an outbreak of COVID on his prison block in recent weeks, which has meant that he's effectively been 24/7 in his cell, not even allowed to leave in order to wash because of the risk of contracting COVID. And we are very concerned about what would happen to him given his ongoing medical conditions as a result of the many years in confinement, the complications that he would suffer as a result of that.
So, Jen, when Joe Biden was U.S. vice president, he likened WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to a high-tech terrorist. That was the strongest criticism from the Obama administration. Reading a piece from The Guardian, it says, Biden claimed that by leaking diplomatic cables, Assange had put lives at risk and made it more difficult for the U.S. to conduct business around the world. Is it conceivable that President Trump would pardon Julian Assange, and would that matter at this point, given that he will not be sent to the United States? At least at this point, the U.S. has appealed.
It is still conceivable that President Trump still has the power to pardon Julian Assange at this point. And of course, while this is an important decision, this decision protects Julian from extradition from the United Kingdom. The indictment and the prosecution still remains afoot. This is an extraordinary prosecution, and I agree with everything that Jamil's had to say about the impact in the United States with respect to First Amendment protections. But it's also concerning for journalists outside of the country, because let's not forget the impact of this ruling is that she would have extradited him had it not been for his particular concerns around his mental health. So this is actually still a very dangerous precedent, and one that the fact that we've won this first step doesn't mean that it's going to be the end of the road. There's still going to be an appeal. And I think all British journalists and journalists outside of the United States need to be looking at this decision as well, to see the fact that they could still potentially be extradited under this precedent, and that's dangerous.
And Jamil Jaffer, I asked Jennifer Robinson to describe what it was that that Julian Assange had released. Among them, a video that he called collateral, that WikiLeaks called collateral damage, which exposed a U.S. Apache helicopter opening fire on a group of Iraqi residents in New Baghdad, an area of Baghdad. They opened fire from the Apache helicopter, having gotten approval from back at the forward operating base. And in addition to killing the Iraqis on the ground, they killed 2 Reuters employees, an up-and-coming journalist, Namir Noor Eldin, a videographer, and his driver, Saeed Shama, who is more than a driver. He often took Reuters journalists around when they were in Iraq. He was the father of 4. It was a horrifying image. Reuters had year after year demanded from the U.S. government if they had video, and it was that video that WikiLeaks released among, well, millions of other documents. But the significance of this, Jamil, and also how U.S. news organizations, like the New York Times, like the Washington Post, treated or backed or didn't back Julian Assange, though they certainly used the information he released.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there's no doubt that that particular disclosure was hugely significant, and that's not the only disclosure that WikiLeaks has made that I think has, made sort of dramatic contributions to public understanding of government policy and national security policy in particular. But I think it's important to think not only about the disclosures that WikiLeaks has made, but rather the disclosures that other news organizations have made, over the past 20 years that would not have been possible or would have been criminalized if one accepts the theory that the U.S. government is asserting in this particular case. Because, if it were in fact the case that the publication of national security secrets was itself a violation of the Espionage Act and not constitutionally protected, which is the government's theory here, then virtually everything we know about the conduct of the so-called war on terror, we wouldn't know it. We wouldn't know about the CIA's secret prisons, but for disclosures of government insiders to the Washington Post, which the Washington Post then published in 2005. We wouldn't know about the warrantless wiretapping program, which the New York Times disclosed. We wouldn't know about the abuses of prisoners in Iraq and Afghanistan, which the New Yorker and 60 Minutes disclosed. Like, all of that stuff was based on disclosures by government insiders to media organizations, which then published classified secrets. And that is precisely the basis on which the government is prosecuting Assange. And I know that there are factual distinctions between the activities that Assange has engaged in, the activities that some New York Times journalists have engaged in. Those factual distinctions don't ultimately matter to the indictment. The indictment, at the end of the day, charges Assange with publishing classified facts. And if you accept that publishing classified facts is not just a violation of the Espionage Act, but not constitutionally protected, then you are endangering not just the kinds of disclosures that WikiLeaks has undertaken, but the disclosures that other media organizations engage in literally every day.
Finally, Jamil, I want to ask you about the push to pardon NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. During a news conference last year, President Trump suggested he would consider granting Edward Snowden a pardon.
There are many, many people. It seems to be a split decision. That many people think that he should be somehow treated differently, and other people think he did very bad things. And I'm going to take a very good look at it.
So that's President Trump. Your final thoughts, Jamil?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should welcome a pardon of Snowden. Whoever it comes from. I would have welcomed it had it come from President Obama, and I would welcome it if it came from President Trump. I think that Snowden has contributed a huge amount to public debate about government surveillance. There are all sorts of reforms to the law that can be traced to Snowden's disclosures in particular. Snowden's disclosures helped us understand the extent to which government officials had misled the public about the scope of the NSA's activities. I think it would be entirely appropriate to pardon him. And I think that it's intolerable that whistleblowers who report to the public gross abuses of civil liberties and human rights pay this very high cost for those disclosures, while the officials who authorize those abuses are appointed to higher and higher posts. I think that's intolerable, and for that reason, I would welcome a pardon.
Well, I want to thank you for being with us. And again, Edward Snowden just announced he just had a baby with his partner. They live in Moscow now. This is Democracy Now! I want to thank Jamil Jaffer, Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. He is the director there. And I want to thank Jennifer Robinson, speaking to us from Sydney, Australia. She is an advisor to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. Next up, as Georgia prepares for 2 Senate runoff elections on Tuesday, President Trump caught on tape threatening Georgia's Republican Secretary of State to overturn Joe Biden's victory in the state. Stay with us.
Georgia,
Georgia on my mind by Las Cafeteras. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we look now at President Trump's extraordinary hour-long phone call to pressure Georgia's Republican Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, to find enough votes to overturn Joe Biden's victory in Georgia's 2020 election. Trump made the call Saturday, nearly 2 weeks before he's due to leave office, and just days before Tuesday's runoff elections in Georgia that will determine the control of the U.S. Senate. The Washington Post released audio of the call Sunday after Trump tweeted he'd spoken to Raffensperger and claimed he was, quote, unwilling or unable to answer questions about allegations of voter fraud. Raffensperger tweeted in response, quote, respectfully, President Trump, what you're saying is not true. The Washington Post obtained the recording of the call in which Trump both berates and begs Raffensperger and even threatens him with criminal charges if he refuses to pursue the false claims and change the certified election results. During the call, Trump also said he could tell he had won Georgia based on rally size, the sizes of his rallies in Georgia. This is part of the exchange.
We have won this election in Georgia based on all of this. And there's nothing wrong with saying that, Brad. You know, I mean, having a correct, the people of Georgia are angry. And these numbers are going to be repeated on Monday night, along with others that we're going to have by that time, which are much more substantial even. And the people of Georgia are angry. The people of the country are angry. And there's nothing wrong with saying that, you know, that you've recalculated.
Well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong.
It's more illegal for you than it is for them because you know what they did and you're not reporting it. That's a criminal offense. And you know, you can't let that happen. That's a big risk to you and to Ryan, your lawyer. That's a big risk. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state.
Mr. President, you have people that submit information, and we have our people that submit information, and then it comes before the court, and the court then has to make a determination. We have to stand by our numbers. We believe our numbers are right.
Well, under law, you're not allowed to give faulty election results, okay? You're not allowed to do that, and that's what you've done. This is a faulty election result. And honestly, this should go very fast. You should meet tomorrow because you have a big election coming up, and because of what you've done to the president, you know, the people of Georgia know that this was a scam. And because of what you've done to the president, a lot of people aren't going out to vote. And a lot of Republicans are going to vote negative because they hate what you did to the president, okay? They hate it. And they're going to vote. And if you would be respected, really respected, if this thing could be straightened out before the election. You have a big election coming up on Tuesday.
So that's President Trump berating, begging, threatening the Republican Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger. Legal experts say Trump's call to Raffensperger appears to violate state and federal laws, with former Obama administration Solicitor General Neil Katyal telling the Washington Post it, quote, demonstrates an impeachable, perhaps criminal offense. Trump plans to address Georgia voters this evening at a rally in the conservative stronghold of Dalton, represented by the newly elected QAnon-supporting Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. Senator Perdue is in quarantine and campaigning virtually after he said he was exposed to a staffer who tested positive for COVID. Meanwhile, President-elect Biden will campaign in Atlanta. Vice President-elect Kamala Harris hit the campaign trail in Savannah over the weekend to support Democratic Senate candidates Reverend Raphael Warnock, pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, where Dr. King grew up and preached, and John Ossoff. This is Ossoff responding to Trump's phone call during a speech to supporters.
At this moment, when the President of the United States calls up Georgia's election officials and tries to intimidate them to change the result of the election, to disenfranchise Georgia voters, to disenfranchise black voters in Georgia who delivered this state for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. That is a direct attack on our democracy.
For more, we go to Atlanta, where we're joined by Insee Ufot, the CEO of New Georgia Project and New Georgia Project Action Fund, organizations that have played a key role in mobilizing voters for the 2020 election and now for Tuesday's runoff election. Over 3 million Georgia residents have already cast their ballots in a record turnout for runoff elections. Insee, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you first respond to this just astounding audio tape of the president threatening, beseeching, berating the Republican Secretary of State of Georgia?
It's astounding, Amy, and good morning. It's unfortunate, though, that this appears to be a continuation of the sort of treatment that our Secretary of State and our governor have been on the receiving end of since the November elections were called. I remember sort of experiencing a lot of pressure to congratulate him and to praise him for sort of refusing the president's attempts and, quite frankly, refusing the National Republican Party's attempts to engage in a criminal conspiracy to steal the elections. I don't pretend to be a constitutional scholar, but I don't know how this is unconstitutional. This has to be criminal.
I mean, you clearly are not a fan of Brian Kemp, who beat Stacey Abrams, one of your colleagues, in the Get Out the Vote campaign that has just been astounding throughout Georgia, a model for the country, or the Republican Secretary of State. You've had problems with issues of voter suppression. But what was your response to how Brad Raffensperger and his attorney, who was on the call, Ryan Germany, what did Trump say when he was talking to Ryan Germany? He said, what's wrong with you? I heard your lawyer is very difficult, actually, but I'm sure you're a good lawyer. You have a nice last name.
Wow. Is my reaction. But one, I mean, I was like, this is absurd. Under any other circumstances, again, this would be disqualifying. I think my concern the Secretary of State's office knew that they were recording the phone call. And so my response is, they comported themselves, I guess, as if they knew that the phone call was being recorded, and they comported themselves as if they knew that they would eventually release it. Again, they are doing their jobs barely, but in some areas they are still very much attacking our sort of elections infrastructure, constructing barriers to participation that Georgia voters have to clear in order to exercise the franchise and participate in our elections.
Which are what are those obstacles, even still?
Oh, well, we are talking about they have cut the number of days for early voting during these runoffs. They have cut the number of early voting locations in some major counties like Cobb County. They've cut over half of the early voting locations. They have cut the number of ballot boxes, drop boxes, where people can, in a COVID-safe way, drop off their absentee ballots. They have announced that they intend to criminally prosecute any group or individual that provides comfort to voters who are waiting in long lines. So our line warming sort of comfort activities, hot chocolate, pizza at the polls, water at the polls, scarves, gloves, PPE. If groups participate, they have been threatened by the Secretary of State in his most recent memo with criminal prosecution. So we are...
I want to go to President Trump, specifically attacking your colleague, the former gubernatorial candidate, Stacey Abrams.
And Stacey Abrams is laughing about, she's going around saying these guys are dumber than a rock. What she's done to this party is unbelievable, I tell you. And I only ran against her once, and that was with a guy named Brian Kemp. and I beat her. And if I didn't run, Brian wouldn't have had even a shot, either in the general or in the primary. He was dead as a doornail. He never thought he had a shot at either one of them. What a schmuck I was.
So there is Trump doing what he feels so comfortable doing, attacking a powerful woman of color. But talk about what you, what Stacey Abrams, what all of these voter groups have done right now. Tomorrow is the election, even though millions have already voted in Seufat. What do you see as the hope for tomorrow?
Right. The hope for tomorrow is that Georgians will block out misinformation, disinformation, and show up at the polls in overwhelming numbers so that we can neutralize all these voter suppression tactics that we see playing out in the state, that we can be reasonably assured that the will of the people is reflected in the results of our elections. And as for Leader Abrams, I think that her intervention she's the architect of an ecosystem, right? So that has exposed many of the deficiencies in Georgia's sort of elections and democracy infrastructure, and has helped start and launch organizations and has invested in leaders that has helped us register almost 1 million Georgians of color in all 159 of Georgia's counties. We have historic levels of turnout. I remember in the aftermath of the November general election, there was so much hand-wringing about the structural advantage that the Republicans have in a runoff election because their base is older and wider. And don't you know that historic turnout, is 30%, 40%. So we shouldn't even bother. Quite frankly, that this will be the most expensive Senate races, the most expensive congressional races in the history of American politics. And the enemies of progress have always had more money, but what we have is people power. And we've seen that during the early voting period with over 3 million Georgians voting already, over 1 million of them being Black Georgians. We've seen historic youth participation, historic youth turnout. And I think that we will see elevated turnout again on tomorrow.
What did your helping to prep your mom, you moved from Nigeria to Georgia, for her citizenship test, teach you about citizenship as we wrap up, Inse?
Okay. Well, my mother and I became citizens together. And so while she worked a second job to hire an immigration attorney, it was my responsibility to make sure that we passed the citizenship exam. And so what it has taught me is, one, that a government of, for, and by the people is an aspiration, and it's something that we have to fight for every day, and it's something that we have to work for. I pledged an allegiance to this country, to the Constitution. I pledged to defend it against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And we are witnessing a domestic attack on our country, on our Constitution, on our way of life. And I encourage all Georgians and all the people under the sound of my voice to join us in not only electing champions, people who will co-govern.
3
with
seconds.
The people. Yes. And so go out and vote tomorrow.
Inse Ufot, I want to thank you for being with us, CEO of the New Georgia Project and New Georgia Project Action Fund. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.